All right, everybody. Hello, hello. Welcome into the latest edition of the Pump Fake, powered by FanDuel. Jarrett Bailey here, flying solo with you on a Wednesday evening. Just a couple days into the offseason for 14 teams, or 18 teams, excuse me, around the NFL. We have Black Monday a couple days ago where, we saw the vast majority of coaches who were fired and all these vacancies become available. But last night, the bombshell that's kind of rippled around the NFL being John Harbaugh fired from Baltimore. We'll talk about that today, as well as the unraveling dysfunction with the Washington Commanders and everything going on there that continues to come out. Our buddy Jordan Schultz doing a really good job on that end of things. And then I do want to talk about the Bengals. I'm going to dive into just my thoughts on that, as well as the other openings around the NFL. So if you're watching on YouTube, please be sure to subscribe. If you're listening as a podcast in the Believe in Steelers podcast feed, please be sure to comment and review. So let's start with the big one. John Harbaugh fired by the Baltimore Ravens. They go 8-9 this season. Start off 1-5, rattle off a bunch of wins in a row. It looked like they were going to battle all the way back and win the AFC North, get a playoff spot some way, shape, or form. They didn't do that. And so it comes out Tuesday that Steve Bisciotti decided that it was time to move on. The rumor being, and it's been reported, that John Harbaugh wasn't willing to move on from offensive coordinator Todd Monken, which, by the way, good for John. Monken has done a really good job with that offense. But the other rumor associated with that is that Monken and Lamar Jackson didn't really gel. And so it sounds like, and this is, pure speculation, it sounds like Harbaugh knew that the offense was working with Monken and wasn't willing to, move off him. And Lamar was being a little bit stingy and maybe a little bit hard to coach. Now, none of the sides are ever going to come out and say that, at least not now. Maybe eventually if there's a book written by one of the parties involved, if Harbaugh, ever decides to open up a little bit about it, maybe he will say that. But, the writing's on the wall where it basically came down to Harbaugh and Monken or Lamar. And the Ravens seem to have, made that decision pretty swiftly. In terms of what the relationship between Harbaugh and Lamar Jackson was, it's been a bunch of speculation about that. It was really fueled earlier in the season when this Reddit post came out of a former WAG, wife or girlfriend of a Ravens player, posted on Reddit saying that Lamar didn't like Harbaugh. There's just a bunch of stuff that people were trying to find in terms of, throwing stuff at a wall to see what the validity of, any sort of dysfunction or dissolving relationship there was between Lamar and Harbaugh. And so, of course, when Harbaugh gets fired, everybody and their mother comes out that's like a national head and says, I cannot believe they fired John Harbaugh. And this isn't me saying that John Harbaugh's a bad coach. He's going to get a job here in the next couple weeks. But, I can believe they fired John Harbaugh because look at what they've done over the last 7 years, 8 years. And since Lamar's been in the NFL, they've won 3 playoff games. Harbaugh's 3-6 in the postseason since they drafted Lamar. One of those games, Snoop Huntley started against Cincinnati, and they almost won that game, by the way. But they haven't had the postseason success of a Buffalo Bills team that's won more than twice the amount of playoff games in that same span. Obviously, of the Chiefs, who have been to 5 Super Bowls and won 3. But, whether it's fair or not, and the results say it's certainly fair, they've been a team that's a juggernaut in the regular season and completely falls apart in the postseason. And you look at their record, that shows it. But I am going to defend John Harbaugh real quick because when we look at Lamar's performances in the postseason, it's not as if Lamar Jackson is without blame. You look at Lamar's numbers in the playoffs for his career. Just over 60% completions, 13 total touchdowns, 7 picks, 7 fumbles, a passer rating of 84.6, and a 3-5 record. Like we can acknowledge Harbaugh's flaws, and there are flaws there with Harbaugh. When it comes to all of these blown late leads, like at some point when it becomes a trend, that falls on the head coach. Against New England, when Derrick Henry scores a touchdown to put them up 2 scores, and then he doesn't touch the ball again, yeah, that's a problem. Like, Harbaugh has his flaws. There's certainly no doubt about that. And it's perfectly okay to point that out. But let's not act like Lamar's without any blame here. And they better hope that they find the right coach who can get through to Lamar, because it was also rumored that in this search, they're looking for somebody that can invigorate Lamar. So all of this comes off as they're trying to find a guy that Lamar likes and can get through to him, which also tells me that Harbaugh and Monken couldn't get through to him, and that there were times where he became uncoachable. So while I understand firing John Harbaugh, you only have 3 playoff wins since Lamar's been in the league. You missed the postseason this year. You go 8-9. All of the end of game heartbreaks that happen this year alone. The loss to Baltimore, or the loss to Buffalo in week 1, the loss to New England, this loss. But it's a meme at this point. You go back to 2020, all the games in which they were leading by double digits late in the game that they've lost, Harbaugh deserves blame for that. And in a season where Mahomes doesn't make the postseason, the Bills, while they are in the postseason, look like a team that is beatable. Joe Burrow doesn't make it to the postseason again. It felt like a pretty wide open opportunity for the Ravens to get there and maybe make some noise and maybe get over that hump. And I understand that Lamar got hurt, but even so, he comes back, and there are games that they should have won that they didn't. And if they had won just one of those, then they're probably in the postseason today. And obviously the kick by Tyler Loop going wide right, if the kick goes in, Harbaugh's still employed today, obviously, because then they're getting ready for a playoff game. And maybe we're having a different conversation about whether or not Mike Tomlin is still in Pittsburgh. I still think he would be, but it's certainly possible that there's a conversation happening about him walking away. And so Harbaugh deserves some blame. Absolutely. He's the head coach. And whenever these things consistently happen, that falls on coaching. I completely understand why they moved on from him. But let's also not completely resolve Lamar of any blame, because his performance in the postseason certainly warrants a lot of blame and is a lot of the reason why the Ravens have failed to get over the hump. So they had better hope that the next guy that they hire knocks it out of the park, because there's no guarantee that whoever you hire is going to be the right guy, going to be able to get through Lamar, and that this is going to work. So, and John Harbaugh will land on his feet. Where's he going to go? The Giants seem to be really in on him. And then there's, reports that teams with head coaches right now have shown interest. If I had to guess which teams those are, a couple of the Florida teams. It was reported by Josina Anderson that the Dolphins checked in. Obviously, Mike McDaniel's still their head coach. I would assume the Tampa Bay Buccaneers have checked in, considering their collapse this season under Todd Bowles. I wonder if the Bengals have. But considering everything that's gone on with Cincinnati the past couple of days, I won't be surprised in the slightest if they didn't. And we'll talk about that in a sec. But I would bet pretty strong money that both the Dolphins and Buccaneers have checked in with Harbaugh and have shown interest. The Bengals would make sense, but again, the way that they've gone about their business, it wouldn't shock me if they haven't reached out. And another team that maybe could have reached out, maybe the Philadelphia Eagles. Remember, that's where John Harbaugh came from. He worked under Andy Reid as a special teams coach, became the head coach of the Ravens in 2008. He's got ties to that team. And the Eagles have shown they have no issues moving off a coach. Does not matter how successful they've been. If they start to fall off, and that's one of the great things about Philadelphia and why they, stay consistently relevant, is that once you stop producing, they'll cut you free and find somebody who will produce. And you look at the Eagles offense this year, it's been, one of the bottom 8 to 10 offenses in the NFL. The Washington Commanders, who were without Jayden Daniels and Terry McLaurin for most of the year, average more yards per game than the Eagles. And so if they're bounced in the first round, which they're playing the 49ers, by no means is that a guaranteed win. If they're bounced in the first round, I wouldn't put it above Howie Roseman to move on from Nick Sirianni, get the hell rid of Kevin Patullo, the offensive coordinator, in the process, and then bring in John Harbaugh as a guy who is going to, set a good culture, build a solid staff, and just be a good CEO and run the ship. So I think that's possible as well. But time will tell. If he does go to the Giants, I'm intrigued to see the staff that he builds. I'm intrigued to see it wherever he goes. But I wonder if Wink Martindale would be part of that staff. Remember, he was the Ravens defensive coordinator before Zach Orr. He's now with the University of Michigan. So I wonder if Wink Martindale would join him on his staff. I think he's going to bring Monken with him as his OC because, again, apparently one of the big reasons why the Ravens decided to move on is because he wasn't willing to move off of Todd Monken. So I assume Todd Monken's going to be his offensive coordinator, and that's a good hire. The Ravens' offense over the past 2 years has been one of the best in football, and Monken's been a good play caller. And in terms of the Giants, if he does go there, I would think it would be a Liam Cohen Jacksonville Jaguars situation where he would say, I'll come here, but you got to fire Joe Shen. I'm not coming here if he's the general manager. And if that's the case, I would say he'll go poach Chad Alexander, the assistant general manager of the Los Angeles Chargers. There's going to be a lot of overlap there, by the way, in terms of these hires. But Chad Alexander is a guy who's been mentioned as a future general manager, and it would not shock me at all if he's a guy that Harbaugh looks at and says, okay, I will, go to where my brother's at right now, look at what they've built there, and I'll take Chad Alexander to be my GM. Would not surprise me in the slightest. But I do think there's going to be a lot of overlap where former Harbaugh assistants, current Harbaugh assistants, guys from the Chargers with his brother that he can, take and build a front office and a staff with, or at least that he'll want to be his general manager. Obviously, he can't build that, but if he says, yeah, I want Chad Alexander, the Giants will be inclined to at least talk to him. But there is a world where this becomes a Liam Cohen situation, where he says, yeah, I'd love to coach the Giants, and I'd love to be, involved with what they have there with Jackson Dart and Cam Scatterbo, Malik Neighbors, and a good defensive front. There's pieces there to build on, but I'm not coming if Joe Shen's there. So if you get rid of Joe Shen, then I'll come. And if you get rid of him, I think that Chad Alexander in Los Angeles should be the guy that you hire. So that's what if I had to guess what's going to happen, that's what I think will happen, is that he'll end up with the Giants. It seems that they are pretty steadfast on getting him, and he'll land on his feet. And I think he'll do a good job with the Giants or wherever he goes. But if I had to guess right now, it'd be the Giants. Let's stick in the NFC East, though, because the Commanders, they fired several assistants. Offensive coordinator Kliff Kingsbury, defensive coordinator Joe Witt, offensive line coach Bobby Johnson, all fired. And initially everybody was very critical of Dan Quinn for the Kingsbury firing, and rightfully so. The defense wasn't good. Joe Witt had to go. The offensive line wasn't good. You understand getting rid of Bobby Johnson. But Kliff Kingsbury, last season, when Jaden Daniels and Terry McLaurin were healthy, they were a top 10 scoring offense, top 3 rushing offense. Jaden Daniels became a superstar overnight. They made it to the NFC title game off the strength of that offense. And then in a year where Jaden goes down long-term, Terry McLaurin goes down long-term, Austin Eckler goes down long-term, the offensive line's bad. And yeah, of course they only win 5 games when all those things happen. But even so, the offense, there were games where they didn't play well, but as an overall product, I mean, they still looked respectable and professional, all things considered. The Commanders, despite all of that, averaged more yards per game than 3 playoff teams. We already talked about the Philadelphia Eagles, but also the Steelers and the Panthers. So they had better overall offenses when their quarterback for most of the year was Marcus Mariota or Josh Johnson. They're throwing to Treylon Burks, Chris Moore, sometimes Deebo Samuel, who at this point, I mean, it's Patrick Ewing in a Magic jersey, Deebo Samuel. And in spite of all that, they let go of Kliff Kingsbury. Well, then Jordan Schultz reports that he hasn't got any sort of inclination that Dan Quinn wanted to fire Kliff Kingsbury. So it sounds like this came from above Dan Quinn, where general manager Adam Peters wanted Kingsbury gone for whatever reason. So there's a lot going on behind the scenes with the Commanders that, if you're a Washington fan, you're looking at all this and saying, oh my goodness, this is the Snyder era all over again. We thought we escaped this, toxic culture, all of this toxicity with this new ownership and this new general manager. And we made it to the NFC title game. And now this whirlwind after a bad season, it's going to give people a lot to worry about. And I understand that. But if you were going to have all these assistants fired, you may as well have thrown the baby out with the bathwater and just started anew. If you're this unsatisfied, you may as well just fire Dan Quinn. And that might have felt a little bit impulsive, but Dan Quinn is a defensive-minded head coach, and his defense has been very bad in each of his 2 seasons with Washington. And there's a lot of blame to go around with why things went bad with the Commanders this year. But in large part, it falls on the defense and the overestimation on the job that Quinn could do with lackluster pieces and the overestimation of what the offense could do to carry a bad unit. Last year, they rode a really good offense to 12 wins and they overachieved. And they assumed coming into this year that they could come pretty close to replicating that as long as the offense stayed as good as it was. And they did almost nothing to improve the defense. Their big move of the offseason was signing Von Miller, who, relatively speaking, in the NFL is about a week and a half older than the Christian faith. That was their big move, signing Von Miller. They didn't do anything really to address a pass rush that hasn't really been existent. Their secondary, their defense as a whole is full of old guys. Old Bobby Wagner, old Von Miller, old Marshawn Lattimore. That's what they came into the season with. And the secondary was bad. The pass rush wasn't good. They're old. They're slow. They couldn't stop anybody. And when Jaden Daniels goes down and you can't score, then yeah, the writing's on the wall pretty quickly there. So all the issues with Washington, yeah, the defense is bad, and Dan Quinn deserves a lot of blame for that. But front office-wise, they did almost nothing to bring in anybody to make it better. They overestimated how good the defense could be based off scheme alone, and they overestimated how good the offense would be, even if they stayed healthy. I mean, last year was tremendous, but replicating that would have been a tough ask on anybody. And they also won a lot of games last year that were very last-second wins. That was never going to translate over seasons. That's not sustainable long-term. So they were naturally going to come down. But as dramatic as they did, we're seeing the repercussions of that. But, from what it sounds like, firing Kliff Kingsbury wasn't a Dan Quinn move. Sounds like it was an Adam Peters move. And that's going to be a very interesting thing to look at going forward in terms of, okay, what are these Commanders going to look like and who's going to be their new OC? I mean, there's certainly names to keep an eye on. If John Harbaugh ends up going to Miami and Mike McDaniel becomes available, then okay, that becomes a very attractive name to bring in for your OC. He's obviously got history with Deebo Samuel. They were together in San Francisco. Although I do think Deebo's a free agent, so that might not matter whatsoever. So you can exclude that, maybe. But in terms of everything that went wrong, it was an overestimation of what the offense could do and thinking that they could sustain that. And it was a very big underestimation of how bad the defense is going to be. All they did in the offseason, okay, we're going to sign old Von Miller to go with old Bobby Wagner and old Marshawn Lattimore. Not going to bring in anybody really in the secondary to make things better. Now, it's not to say they don't have any pieces there. Mike Sainristil's a good player, but he was bouncing around inside, outside, trying to figure out where the best spot for him is. And they just don't have a ton of proven talent on that side of the ball. So all the worst things that could happen for Washington this year happened with all the injuries on offense and the defense playing as bad as it was. They were last in the NFL in total defense. They're old, they're slow, and they need a complete revamp on that side of the ball. And when that's what your head coach specializes in, that leaves a lot of fans worried because the defense hasn't been good for 2 years since Dan Quinn's gotten there. And they're going to be understandably worried. All right, so other stuff going on over the past few days when it comes to the coaching carousel. I do want to talk about the Bengals. I wrote a piece on the Sporting News yesterday talking about just the complete lack of seriousness when it comes to Mike Brown and how that organization is run. When you had Joe Burrow in the beginning of December sitting in front of the media and everybody saying, yeah, football has to be fun for me to continue doing this. And every star on that offense publicly saying something's got to change in the offseason because this isn't working. And you hear that. And then we come out of Monday, Mike Brown announces that not only is Zach Taylor coming back, but so is Duke Tobin. And on top of that, Zach Taylor says he's making 0 staff changes, which means Al Golden, the defensive coordinator, is coming back after a tumultuous year on that side of the ball for the Bengals. And they are doing the dictionary definition of running it back with what they currently have. And when you're a team who hasn't been to the postseason in 3 years, I understand that Joe Burrow got hurt this year, but even last year, when Burrow threw for damn near 5,000 yards, 43 touchdowns, and you only got to 9 wins because the defense is that bad, the head coach is that bad, and you continue to run it back, you are no longer a serious football organization that cares about winning. Mike Brown runs the Bengals like they're a Ringling Brothers circus. He treats it as if it's, all right, come on down and see Joe Burrow be awesome on a Sunday. Not like it's a professional football team trying to contend to win championships. If he cared about that, then you would have fired Zach Taylor. It's incredible that the AFC North fired 2 coaches and Zach Taylor wasn't one of them. He has somehow outlived Kevin Stefanski, a 2-time coach of the year, and John Harbaugh, a Super Bowl winning coach who was the second longest tenured coach in the NFL. These aren't things that a serious organization that's serious about winning does. It would have been one thing to bring back Zach Taylor if you fired Duke Tobin, but you brought back Duke Tobin, who couldn't manage a target, and he's going to be in charge of putting together the roster. He's going to be your top executive for the 27th straight year. That is what the Bengals are doing. Mike Brown is in the business of putting people in the stadium, and as long as butts are in seats, he's happy. The Bengals are in the top half of attendance. They're still going to make money. And as long as they do that, Mike Brown is A-okay with it. This isn't a team serious about winning. And I feel bad for Bengals fans. I feel bad for Joe Burrow, Jamar Chase, T. Higgins, all the stars on that team worth a damn. Because they're still going to continue to play well, but it's not going to matter because they are surrounded by incompetent people on the coaching staff and in the front office that refuse to make changes to help this team win. I feel very bad for Bengals fans and the stars on that team because they're not going to go anywhere as long as Mike Brown owns the team and as long as Duke Tobin and the Blackburns are a part of that front office. It's a shame because the world is better. The NFL world is better when Joe Burrow's in the postseason. We get to see him play meaningful football. And as long as Zach Taylor's the guy in charge, as long as Mike Brown's the guy who owns the team, and as long as Duke Tobin's in charge of talent evaluation in the draft, they're not going to sniff that. Doesn't matter how great your quarterback is. Doesn't matter how great the two wide receivers are when the 50 other guys on the team aren't good. So I feel bad for the Bengals, and I feel bad for their fans. And I feel bad for Joe Burrow. Because I just can't put into words how little it makes sense to run back what the Bengals have done. 6 wins this past year, 9-8 the year before. Haven't been to the postseason since 2022. And you're going to run this thing back again. It's just the definition of incompetency and being completely content with mediocrity and not worried about winning. It's a shame. And we're going to see what happens with these other jobs that are open. Arizona open right now. I'll be intrigued to see who they get. I don't think it's going to be a big name. I don't think any big names are going to Arizona. It could be an Anthony Weaver from Miami, although they just fired defensive-minded Jonathan Gannon. Usually when you see a team do that, they go on the opposite side of the ball. Jonathan Gannon, defensive-minded coach. I would assume they go offensive-minded coach here. We're seeing Dan Pitcher, Bengals OC, get some head coaching interviews. And a lot of Bengals fans think he's the best coach on that staff. So maybe they go that route. Or it's a Dan Pitcher or an up-and-coming name from the Jaguars staff, from the Rams staff. I mean, there's a handful of guys from both of those staffs that both people or that both teams are going to have interest from. So intrigued to see what happens. Cleveland's the interesting one because I could see like a big notable veteran name going there to help turn around that ship. And I know Connor Orr had mentioned maybe that's the Mike McCarthy destination, and maybe it is. I mean, he's a Midwest guy. He's from Pittsburgh, spent a ton of years in Green Bay. I think that Cleveland would be good for him, and I think he would be great for Cleveland. He's a proven winner. And if given the time to fix all of that to the best of his ability, I think it could work. I don't think that they're going to do anything in 2026 because they have to rebuild the offensive line because every left tackle, left guard, center, right guard, right tackle, all of them are free agents. They got to completely reassemble an offensive line. They got to find a quarterback. They got to find skill positions. The defense is good, but we've seen over the past 3 years now, it doesn't matter how good the defense is when the offense is that terrible. And if they would bring in Mike McCarthy, I think it would be better, but that's not a 1 year. It's not going to be like Chicago where Ben Johnson goes there and they turn things around immediately because they already had pieces in place in Chicago. Now, they made moves for, I believe, 3 different offensive linemen, but the quarterback was already there. A few weapons were already there. This isn't going to be a 1 year turnaround in Cleveland. It's going to take some time. And if you put your faith in a guy like Mike McCarthy, I think that if given time, he can make it work. Obviously, the guy who just left there, Kevin Stefanski, his name's going to garner a lot of interest. He met with the Giants today. But, with John Harbaugh being fired, it certainly looks like Harbaugh is their top name. And so if Harbaugh goes to the Giants, there's other openings that Stefanski could look at. There's the Falcons opening after they fired Raheem Morris. There is the Cardinals opening, the Raiders opening. But if I'm Kevin Stefanski, I'm not in a hurry to take any of those jobs. If I'm Stefanski and like a high-profile offensive coordinator job is available, I might go do that for a year or two and then be able to kind of pick my spot, similar to what Ben Johnson did, where, 2 years ago, we thought Ben Johnson was going to be a head coach. He stays in Detroit for a couple of years to be able to pick where he wants to go. I wouldn't be surprised if we see Stefanski do that, because I'm not in a rush to go to Vegas, not in a rush to go to Arizona. So maybe the Commanders' offensive coordinator job is calling his name. And that if they do fire Dan Quinn, they've got a 2-time coach of the year right there ready to just take over. I think the Chiefs' job would make sense for Stefanski. They're not bringing back Matt Nagy. It's pretty clear that he's going to go elsewhere, whether that's as a head coach or in a different role. But he's interviewing for the Titans head job. I believe he's also interviewing for the Cardinals head job. So if I'm Kevin Stefanski and the Chiefs offensive coordinator job is a possibility, that's something I'm taking very much into consideration, because Andy Reid's not going to be around forever. Similar to Washington to a degree, but if they do move on from their head coach, or if Andy decides to step away and retire, then you got Kevin Stefanski right there, and you don't have to go through a long process of trying to find another guy. So if I'm Kevin Stefanski, I'm not worried. My phone's going to keep ringing, and that's great. But I'm not sprinting or rushing to go to Vegas or to go to Arizona or even Tennessee to a degree. I might wait for a higher profile job with a little bit more stability, more pieces in place to become available, rather than just settle for one of the jobs that are just currently available. So I'll be intrigued to see how all this goes down. I will be writing a piece predicting where all these guys are going to end up, who's going to be the head coach of who. A lot of prediction pieces. This, beginning of the offseason, it's one of the more fun things to do, is just kind of pick and choose and predict what you think is going to happen. It's one of the more fun parts of this industry. Also going to be releasing my 2025 season awards. So you can check all of that out over on the Snap Substack here in the coming days. If you're watching this on YouTube, again, please be sure to subscribe to the channel. We'll be back on the Pump Fake, me and Todd Haley, on Friday to preview Wild Card Weekend. And then in your podcast feed for Believe in Steelers on Monday morning, Steelers-Texans preview for your drive to work, your drive home from work to get you set for Steelers-Texans. Again, the preview show for Steelers-Texans comes out Monday morning in your podcast feed, so keep that in mind. And then me and Todd will be back on Friday to preview Wild Card Weekend as a whole. So that's the next time you'll hear from me and Todd Haley, is on Friday. And then for the Steelers fans, the Steelers-centric portion of the podcast feed, Steelers-Texans preview will be Monday morning. So appreciate everybody for tuning in. Again, subscribe to the YouTube if you're watching on YouTube. If you're listening as a podcast, leave a comment, leave a review. Before we go, let's give a special shout out to our friends at FanDuel. If you're looking to make some money this weekend on Wild Card Weekend, a lot of close spreads. The biggest spread by far is Rams-Panthers. The line opened at 10.5 in favor of the Rams, and that is where it has stayed. So might be something worth looking at if you're looking to make some money on Wild Card Weekend. Appreciate everybody for tuning in. We'll be back later on in the week right here on the Pump Fake.